A wolf surprised everyone by invading a church service. Initially, it seemed to be simply asking the local pastor for help. Following the animal through the forest, they found something that would shock them all. The sensitivity of animals and humans can move the world. Before hearing this breathtaking story, remember to subscribe to the channel. The full moon hung over the small town of Pine Grove, nestled in the hills of Vermont. The silence of the night was broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Pastor David walked slowly back to his modest parish after a late visit to an ailing parishioner. His footsteps echoed on the cobblestone streets as he reflected on the challenges his community faced. The town, once thriving, now struggled against rural exodus and an aging population. David, at 45, still considered himself young for a pastor, but he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He ran his hand through his graying hair, remembering when he arrived in Pine Grove 10 years ago, full of ideals and hope. As he approached the church, a movement in the shadows caught his attention. Instinctively, he quickened his pace, his heart racing. The figure emerged from the darkness, and David froze. An imposing wolf stood just a few meters away, its amber eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The initial fear gave way to curiosity when David realized that the animal showed no aggression. On the contrary, the wolf seemed anxious, moving back and forth, looking at the pastor and then towards the direction of the forest. "What do you want, friend?" David murmured, surprised by his own calmness. The wolf took a few steps towards the forest, stopped and looked back, as if inviting the pastor to follow. David hesitated. His rational mind told him to ignore the animal and enter the safety of the church. But something in his heart, a voice he often associated with his vocation, urged him to follow. With a deep sigh, he made the sign of the cross and began to walk in the direction indicated by the wolf. As they entered the forest, David remembered his childhood on his parents' farm, where he often helped injured animals. This memory comforted him as he followed the wolf through the trees, the moonlight filtering through the leaves and creating a mosaic of shadows on the forest floor. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes, the wolf stopped in a small clearing. There, under an old oak tree, David saw a scene that made his heart clench. An injured she-wolf lying on her side, with 3 pups nestled against her. The she-wolf raised her head as she saw them approach, a low growl escaping her throat. The wolf that had guided David quickly approached her, touching his nose to hers in a gesture that seemed almost human in its tenderness. David stood paralyzed, marveling at the scene before him. The wolf turned to him, as if inviting him to approach. With slow and cautious steps, the pastor advanced, speaking in a low and gentle voice. "It's all right, I'm here to help," he murmured, more to himself than to the animals. As he got closer, he could see the wound on the she-wolf's hind leg, a deep laceration that was slowly bleeding. Without thinking twice, David removed his jacket, tearing a strip of fabric to use as a bandage. With slow and deliberate movements, he knelt beside the injured she-wolf. The animal watched him with a mixture of fear and hope in her golden eyes. "It's going to be okay," David whispered, slowly extending his hand. To his surprise, the she-wolf didn't recoil. She seemed to understand that he was there to help. As he cleaned and bandaged the wound, David found himself immersed in an almost mystical experience. There in the heart of the forest, under the watchful gaze of the moon and stars, he felt a deep connection with these creatures, a bond that transcended the barriers between species. The pups, curious, approached, sniffing his hands as he worked. The male wolf remained on guard, alternating his gaze between David and the surrounding forest. When he finished the improvised dressing, David moved back a bit, observing the wolf family. The she-wolf tried to stand up but was still weak. The male lay down beside her, gently licking her face. It was at that moment that David heard distant voices and the barking of dogs. His heart raced as he recognized the sounds. Hunters. They were approaching the clearing. In an instant, David made a decision. He couldn't allow this family to be discovered in such a vulnerable state. With renewed determination, he stood up, ready to protect these creatures that had inexplicably trusted him. "Stay here," he murmured to the wolves, knowing that somehow they understood. "I'll lead them away." With quick steps, David headed in the direction of the voices. His mind raced, seeking the right words to convince the hunters to move away without raising suspicion. He knew that this night would change not only the fate of this wolf family, but also his own, and perhaps that of the entire town of Pine Grove. As he walked, David reflected on the significance of this unlikely encounter. It was as if St. Francis of Assisi himself had guided his steps tonight, reminding him of the sanctity of all God's creation. With this inspiration, he prepared to face the approaching challenge, determined to protect life in all its forms. The hunters' voices grew louder with each step. David took a deep breath, summoning all his courage and faith. What would happen next would define not only the fate of the wolves, but also test the compassion and understanding of his community. With a final silent prayer, he emerged from the shadows of the forest, ready to intercede on behalf of his new and unlikely flock. David emerged from the dense vegetation, his heart pounding as he faced a group of 5 men, all armed and accompanied by agitated hunting dogs. The light from their flashlights cut through the darkness of the forest, creating dancing shadows on the trees around them. "Pastor David?" exclaimed Jake, the town butcher, surprised to see the clergyman emerge from the shadows. "What are you doing out here at this hour of the night?" David took a deep breath, searching for words that could dissuade the hunters without revealing the presence of the wolves. "Good evening, my friends," he began, his calm voice masking the anxiety he felt. "I was taking a night walk to clear my mind when I heard you approaching. What brings you to the forest so late?" Mark, a young farmer known for his impulsive temperament, stepped forward. "Wolves, Pastor. We spotted a pair of them near the farms yesterday. We can't risk them attacking our livestock or, God forbid, our children." David felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he needed to act quickly to protect the wolf family without alienating his parishioners. "I understand your concern, Mark," he said softly, "but perhaps there's a better way to deal with this than violence." Jake frowned. "With all due respect, Pastor, you don't understand. These animals are a threat to our community." "I understand more than you might think," David replied, his voice gaining a note of authority. "Before I became a pastor, I worked with my uncle, who was a veterinarian. I learned a lot about animals, including predators like wolves. They rarely attack humans and, in fact, play a crucial role in balancing our ecosystem." The men exchanged skeptical looks, but David noticed that he had captured their attention. He continued, "Think about it. Wolves keep the population of wild boars and deer under control, which would otherwise destroy our crops. They are part of God's creation, just as we are." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. David seized the moment to approach Hank, the oldest and most respected among the hunters. "Hank, do you remember the stories your grandfather used to tell? About how St. Francis spoke to the animals? Even to the wolf of Gubbio?" Hank nodded slowly, his eyes softening with the memory. "Yes, Pastor. My grandfather loved that story." "Then perhaps we can follow that example," David suggested. "Instead of reacting with fear and violence, we could seek a way to coexist peacefully with these creatures." Mark, still unconvinced, intervened. "And how would we do that, Pastor? Talk to the wolves like St. Francis?" David smiled gently. "Not exactly, Mark, but we can take measures to protect our livestock without harming the wolves. Better fences, trained shepherd dogs, even sound devices that keep them away from the farms. There are many options that don't involve bloodshed." As he spoke, David noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The men seemed less tense, more receptive to his words. Even the dogs had calmed down, sitting at their owner's feet. Jake scratched his beard thoughtfully. "The pastor has a point. My cousin in Montana told me about some of these methods. Maybe it's worth a try." Hank, with the wisdom of his years, added, "My grandfather always said that the land is a gift from God and that we should take care of all his creatures. Perhaps it's time we honored that teaching." David felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Exactly, my friends. And I promise you that I won't leave you to face this challenge alone. Tomorrow we'll start planning how we can protect our families and our livelihoods while respecting the lives of these animals." Mark, although still seeming a bit skeptical, lowered his weapon. "Well, if the pastor is willing to help us, I guess we can give this idea a chance." With the tensions dissipated, David suggested that everyone return to town. "It's getting late, and we have a lot to discuss tomorrow. How about we meet after the service to start planning?" The men agreed, and soon the group was heading back to Pine Grove. David stayed behind, claiming he wanted to offer a prayer of thanks for the wisdom and compassion of his parishioners. As soon as the flashlights disappeared among the trees, David ran back to the clearing where he had left the wolves. To his relief, the family was still there, the injured she-wolf looking at him with what seemed to be gratitude in her golden eyes. "Are you safe for now?" David whispered, kneeling beside them, "but we have a lot of work ahead of us." As he examined the she-wolf's bandage, David reflected on the events of the night. He knew that convincing the entire town wouldn't be easy, but what had happened with the hunters gave him hope, perhaps just as St. Francis had transformed the Wolf of Gubbio from a feared threat into a beloved guardian of the city. He could help transform the relationship between Pine Grove and its lupine neighbors. The male wolf approached, gently touching David's arm with his muzzle. The pastor smiled, feeling a deep connection with these animals that, just a few hours ago, would have been considered enemies. "We're going to make this work," David promised, both to the wolves and to himself. "Together we'll find a way." As the night progressed, David remained in the clearing, watching over the wolf family and planning the next steps. He knew that the following days would be crucial, not only for the fate of these animals, but for the entire community of Pine Grove. As the sky began to lighten in the east, heralding the arrival of a new day, David stood up, preparing to return to town. He had a sermon to prepare, one that he hoped could open the hearts and minds of his parishioners to a new way of seeing the world around them. With a last look at the wolf family, now sleeping peacefully under the oak tree, David made the sign of the cross. "May St. Francis guide our steps," he murmured, before turning and walking back to Pine Grove, determined to initiate the transformation he knew was necessary. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself was blessing his mission. David smiled, feeling a renewal of purpose and faith. The challenge ahead was great, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time, with compassion, wisdom, and the firm belief in the capacity for change in the human heart. The church bell of Pine Grove rang, calling the faithful to Sunday service. Pastor David stood at the pulpit, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces of his congregation. The church was fuller than usual. News of the previous night's events had spread quickly through the small town. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew that the words he would speak today could change the course of Pine Grove's history and the fate of the wolf family that now depended on him. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, his voice firm and warm, echoing off the stone walls of the old church. "Today, I'd like to speak about a theme that might surprise some of you. Compassion for our animal brothers, especially those we often fear." A murmur ran through the congregation. David saw expressions of curiosity, skepticism, and even a bit of apprehension. He continued, "Last night I had an experience that powerfully reminded me of the words of St. Francis of Assisi. As many of you may have already heard, I found myself face to face with a family of wolves in our forest." Audible gasps echoed through the church. David raised his hand, asking for silence. "I know many of you fear these animals, and with reason. But what I saw last night were not fierce, bloodthirsty creatures. I saw a family, a protective father, an injured mother, and helpless pups. I saw God's creatures, as worthy of compassion and respect as any of us." He paused, letting his words sink in. St. Francis taught us that all of God's creation is sacred. He called animals brothers and sisters. And last night, I deeply understood what he meant. David then shared the full story of his encounter with the wolves, describing how the male wolf had guided him to his injured mate, how he had treated the she-wolf's wound, and how he had interceded with the hunters. "At that moment," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I felt I was living the true spirit of the gospel. 'Love one another as I have loved you,' Jesus said. And this love, my friends, is not limited only to human beings." He looked directly at Jake, the butcher, and Mark, the young farmer. "Our friends here present showed great wisdom and compassion in listening to a different perspective. They chose the path of dialogue and understanding, instead of violence." David then turned to the rest of the congregation. "Now, I ask all of you to follow this example. I'm not suggesting we ignore the real challenges we face. Yes, we need to protect our livestock and our families. But we can do this in a way that respects all life. He then outlined his plan for peaceful coexistence with the wolves, better fences, shepherd dogs, sound devices, and most importantly, he added, we need to educate ourselves and our children. The more we understand these animals, the less we will fear them. As David spoke, he could see expressions changing. Some still looked skeptical, but many others showed signs of interest and even enthusiasm. Remember, he concluded, St. Francis didn't just talk to the wolf of Gubbio, he transformed the relationship between the animal and the entire town. The wolf, once feared, became a beloved guardian. Imagine what we could achieve if we followed this example. When the service ended, the church was buzzing with animated discussions. David stood at the door, talking with parishioners as they left. Some expressed concerns, but many others offered support and even ideas for the plan. Sarah, the local school teacher, approached with eyes shining with enthusiasm. Pastor, what about including wildlife classes in our curriculum? We could teach the children about the important role that wolves play in our ecosystem. What a wonderful idea, Sarah, David replied, feeling a wave of hope. That would be a great start to changing perceptions from an early age. Hank, the older hunter, also approached. Pastor, I've been thinking. Maybe we could organize patrols to monitor the wolves' movements. Not to hunt them, understand, but to better understand their habits and protect both them and our livestock. David nodded enthusiastically. Hank, that's exactly the kind of initiative we need. Your experience will be invaluable. Even Mark, who had been the most skeptical the night before, seemed to be reconsidering. I'm still not fully convinced, Pastor, he admitted, but I'm willing to try. If St. Francis could do it in Gubbio, maybe we can do something similar here in Pine Grove. As the last of the parishioners left, David found himself alone in the church. He knelt before the altar, offering a silent prayer of gratitude. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but he felt that a seed of change had been planted. Rising, David prepared for the meeting he had scheduled with the hunters. There was much work to be done, plans to be drawn up, resources to be gathered, minds to be changed. But for the first time since he had encountered the wolves, he felt a real hope that a peaceful solution was possible. As he walked out of the church, the afternoon sun bathed the town square in a golden light. David smiled, remembering the words of St. Francis, "Start by doing what's necessary, then do what's possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible." With that inspiration in mind, he headed to the meeting, ready to take the next step towards a future where humans and wolves could coexist in harmony. The journey would be challenging, but David was determined to see it happen, one heart at a time. The weeks following that fateful night in the forest were a whirlwind of activity in Pine Grove. Pastor David barely had time to breathe between meetings with farmers, planning sessions with community leaders, and regular visits to the wolf family in the forest. The injured she-wolf, whom David had affectionately nicknamed Luna, was recovering well. His nightly visits to change her bandages had become a ritual he eagerly anticipated. On these occasions, David felt a deep connection with nature, reaffirming his conviction that they were on the right path. However, not everything was smooth sailing. Despite initial support from many in the town, David faced resistance from a vocal group of skeptics. The most prominent among them was Richard, the mayor of Pine Grove. "Pastor, with all due respect," Richard argued during a heated town council meeting, "you're placing the safety of wild animals above the well-being of our community. We can't afford to risk our lives and livelihoods because of a few wolves." David remained calm, though he felt his heart race. "Mayor Richard, I understand your concerns, but we're not choosing between wolves and people. We're seeking a solution that benefits everyone. The methods we've proposed are already showing positive results." It was true. The new fences and shepherd dogs provided by a conservation NGO had significantly reduced attacks on livestock. Farmers were reporting less damage to their crops, as the wolves were keeping the wild boar and deer populations under control. Sarah, the teacher, stood up to support David. "The children are loving the new wildlife classes. They're developing a real appreciation for nature." "This is an investment in our community's future," Richard snorted, unconvinced. "And what about tourism? Who's going to want to visit a town full of wolves?" It was then that Jake, the butcher, surprised everyone with an unexpected idea. "Actually, Mayor, I think we could use this to our advantage. What if we turned Pine Grove into an eco-tourism destination? A murmur of interest ran through the room. David looked at Jake with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. Jake continued, gaining confidence. Think about it. We could offer guided wolf-watching tours, conservation classes, authentic rural American experiences. There are lots of people in the world who would pay good money for that. The idea caught fire. Soon the room was buzzing with animated discussions about the possibilities. Even Richard seemed intrigued, though still skeptical. David watched, amazed at how things were unfolding. He couldn't help but think there was something almost miraculous in the way the community was coming together around this cause. After the meeting, as he walked back to the church, David was approached by Emily, a young biologist who had recently returned to Pine Grove after years of studying away. "Pastor," she said, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, "I want to help. I have experience in field research with predators. I can help monitor the wolves, educate the community about their behavior, maybe even secure funding for a long-term study." David smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "Emily, your help would be invaluable. Welcome aboard." That night, as he made his usual visit to the wolf family, David reflected on the day's events. He watched Luna, now almost fully recovered, playing with her growing pups. The male wolf, whom he had begun to call Francis in honor of St. Francis, kept guard nearby. "You have no idea what you've started," David murmured to the wolves. "Or maybe you do. Who knows what ancient wisdom you carry?" Suddenly, a noise in the vegetation alerted him. David turned, fearing it might be hunters. To his surprise, he saw Richard emerge from the shadows. The mayor looked uncomfortable, glancing nervously at the wolves. "Pastor," he said quietly, I wanted to see for myself." David nodded, inviting Richard to approach. "They won't hurt you. Come, let me introduce you to the family." Slowly, cautiously, Richard approached. Luna raised her head, her golden eyes meeting the mayor's. For a long moment, man and wolf stared at each other. Then, to David's surprise, Richard knelt down, slowly extending his hand. Luna hesitated for an instant before approaching and sniffing his fingers. "Extraordinary," whispered Richard, a hesitant smile forming on his face. At that moment, David knew they had turned an important page. The road ahead would still be challenging, but with each heart changed, each mind opened, they were one step closer to achieving the dream of true harmony between humans and nature. As the sun set over the Pine Grove forest, casting long shadows between the trees, David felt a deep peace. He knew this story was far from over, but each chapter seemed more promising than the last. The months that followed brought significant changes to Pine Grove. The small Vermont town, once sleepy, now pulsed with new energy. Jake's ecotourism plan had become a reality, and the first groups of visitors were beginning to arrive, eager to glimpse the now famous wolves of Pine Grove. Emily, the young biologist, had become a central figure in the community. Her wolf monitoring program not only provided valuable data for conservation, but also offered local residents and visitors the opportunity to participate in field research. On a sunny spring morning, David walked through the town square, marveling at the transformations. Local craft stalls displayed wolf-inspired products, wooden sculptures, paintings, even artisanal cheeses with creative names like Full Moon and Mountain Howl. "Pastor David," called Sarah, the teacher, waving enthusiastically from one of the stalls. "Come see what the children have made." Approaching, David saw an exhibition of drawings and stories created by the local school students. Each work portrayed the wolves not as fearsome creatures, but as guardians of the forest, partners of the community. "This is wonderful, Sarah," said David, feeling a wave of emotion. "You're cultivating the next generation of nature defenders." As they talked, Hank, the former hunter, now an ecotourism guide, approached with a group of foreign visitors. "And here," Hank announced proudly, "is the man who started it all, Pastor David, the guardian of the Pine Grove wolves." David blushed at the attention, but took the opportunity to share the story of the town's transformation. The tourists listened, fascinated, taking photos and asking animated questions. "It's amazing how a community can change when it opens its heart to nature," commented an American tourist, visibly moved. As the group moved away, Richard approached, a broad smile on his face. "Pastor, you won't believe the latest news. I just got a call from the state capitol. They want to use Pine Grove as a model for a new conservation program throughout Vermont. David was speechless. Richard, that's incredible. The mayor nodded enthusiastically. And there's more. A documentary team wants to make a film about our story. They think it could inspire other communities around the world. The news spread quickly through the town, sparking a wave of celebration. That night, an impromptu party took over the square. Music, dance, and laughter filled the air as residents and visitors celebrated together. Amid the joy, David discreetly slipped away, feeling the need to share the moment with those who had started it all. He walked to the forest, towards the spot where he knew he would find Luna, Francis, and their pups, now almost adults. As he reached the familiar clearing, David was greeted by a sight that took his breath away. Luna and Francis were there as expected, but they weren't alone. Several other wolves, likely attracted by the safety and abundance that now characterized the area, had joined the group. "Hello, my friends," whispered David, sitting quietly at the edge of the clearing. Luna, recognizing him, approached, closely followed by her now-grown pups. She gently touched David's hand with her muzzle, a gesture that always filled him with wonder. "You have no idea what you started," he said softly, stroking Luna's soft fur. "Or maybe you do. Who knows what ancient wisdom you carry?" As he watched the wolves, David reflected on the incredible journey of the past few months. Fear had transformed into respect, ignorance into understanding, and a small Vermont town had become a beacon of hope for coexistence between humans and wildlife. Suddenly, one of the wolves raised its head and let out a long, melodious howl. One by one, the others joined in, creating a wild symphony that echoed through the forest. David closed his eyes, letting the primitive music envelop him. At that moment, he felt a deep connection, not just with the wolves, but with all of creation. It was as if St. Francis himself was there, smiling in approval. When the last howl faded into the night air, David opened his eyes, a new determination shining in his gaze. He knew the work was far from over. There would be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But looking at Luna and her growing family, at the lush forest around him, and thinking of the transformed community that awaited him in town, he knew they were on the right path. "Thank you," he whispered, not just to the wolves, but to the universe, for this lesson in love, compassion, and interconnection. Rising, David made the sign of the cross, silently blessing his lupine friends before turning to return to town. The distant sound of celebration called him back, reminding him that this story of transformation belonged to all of them, wolves, humans, and the very land they shared. Pine Grove's success did not go unnoticed. As news of the town's transformation spread, visitors from all corners of the world began to arrive, eager to witness the miracle of coexistence between humans and wolves. Among these visitors was Jessica Reynolds, a renowned environmental journalist from New York City. Her arrival caused a stir in the quiet community. "Pastor David," Jessica approached him after Sunday service, her eyes shining with curiosity. "I've come to tell Pine Grove's story to the world. How did you achieve this extraordinary transformation?" David smiled, remembering the journey. "It wasn't easy, Jessica. It started with an act of compassion and transformed into something bigger than any of us could have imagined." In the days that followed, Jessica immersed herself in the life of the town. She accompanied Hank on ecotourism tours, observed Sarah's conservation classes, and spent hours talking with local residents. One afternoon, while walking with Emily during one of her monitoring expeditions, Jessica made an insightful observation. "You know, the most impressive thing isn't just the wolves, but how this has changed people. You've created a model of a sustainable community." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "It's true. Our farming methods have changed to become more wildlife-friendly. We're using fewer pesticides, planting ecological corridors, and the best part is that our production has increased." Jessica's report, when finally published, caused a sensation. The Miracle of Pine Grove, How Wolves Saved a Town, went viral overnight. Suddenly, the small community was at the center of global attention. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Politicians from all over America began visiting Pine Grove, eager to learn and replicate its success. Environmental NGOs offered partnerships and funding, Universities proposed research programs. In the midst of this whirlwind, David struggled to maintain balance. He feared that the sudden influx of attention and money could corrupt the spirit of what they had built. One evening, as he walked through the now busy square, he overheard a heated discussion. Richard was at a cafe table with a group of imposing-looking businessmen. "A luxury resort would be perfect," one of them was saying excitedly. "We could bring in high-end tourists, really capitalize on this wolf story." David felt his heart sink. It was exactly the kind of development he feared. Before he could intervene, however, it was Richard who spoke. "I appreciate your proposal, gentlemen, but I'm afraid it's not compatible with Pine Grove's values. Our priority is the balance between community and nature, not maximum profit." David couldn't contain a proud smile. Richard had truly embraced the vision they shared. In the days that followed, the community gathered to discuss their future. In an assembly in the central square, residents of all ages shared their ideas and concerns. "We need to be careful not to become victims of our own success," Hank warned. "The wolves taught us about balance. We should apply that lesson to our development." Sarah added, "What about an environmental education center? We could share our knowledge with the world, inspire other communities." Ideas flowed, each reflecting the new spirit of Pine Grove: sustainability, respect for nature, community. At the end of the meeting, David stood up to speak. "My friends," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "what we've achieved here is precious. It's not just about wolves or tourism. It's about rediscovering our connection with God's creation, about living in harmony with nature and with each other." He paused, looking at the attentive faces around him. "We have the opportunity to be a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needs it. Let's move forward with wisdom, always remembering the lessons our lupine friends have taught us." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. There was a palpable feeling of shared purpose, of being on the brink of something truly significant. That night, after the meeting, David took his usual walk to the forest. He found Luna and her family in the familiar clearing. As he sat among the wolves, sharing the silence of the night, he reflected on the path ahead. Pine Grove was changing the world, one heart at a time, and although the challenges were great, David knew that with compassion, wisdom, and divine guidance, they would find the right path. The distant howl of a wolf echoed through the forest, as if it were a call to the future. David smiled, feeling ready for whatever came next. The journey continued, and he could hardly wait to see where it would lead them. The year following Jessica's report was one of intense activity for Pine Grove. The town became a living laboratory of sustainability and coexistence, attracting researchers, environmentalists, and community leaders from around the world. The Environmental Education Center, envisioned by Sarah, became a reality. An old barn was renovated, transforming into a modern and welcoming space where visitors could learn about ecology, conservation, and the delicate balance between human development and nature preservation. On a sunny autumn morning, David proudly watched as a group of students from an American university participated in a practical class on habitat restoration. Emily led the team, explaining how the techniques developed in Pine Grove were helping to regenerate degraded areas. "The secret is to work with nature, not against it," Emily explained, her face lit up with enthusiasm. "The wolves taught us that each species has its role in the ecosystem. Our task is to restore that balance." As he walked through the town, David noticed other subtle but significant changes. The roofs of houses now sported solar panels, a clean energy project implemented with the help of an international NGO. Community gardens flourished in previously empty spaces, providing fresh, organic food for local residents and restaurants. Most impressive, however, was the change in people. There was a new sparkle in the eyes of Pine Grove residents, a sense of purpose and pride that went beyond the economic success brought by ecotourism. Jake, the butcher who had proposed the idea of ecological tourism, now led a sustainable meat production project. "We've discovered that we can raise cattle in a way that benefits the ecosystem," he explained to David. "Pasture rotation, holistic management. We're even collaborating with farmers from other regions to spread these practices." Even Richard, once skeptical, had become a passionate advocate for Pine Grove's new vision. He was leaving for an international conference on sustainable development, where he would share the town's story. "Who would have thought, Pastor?" Richard laughed, adjusting his tie. From a forgotten town to a global model, and to think it all started with that night in the forest. David smiled, remembering the incredible journey they had traveled. God works in mysterious ways, Richard. Sometimes we just need to be open to listening. However, not everything was rosy. The rapid growth and sudden fame brought new challenges. Some older residents complained about the changes, feeling that the town was losing its traditional identity. Others feared that the influx of visitors could disturb the delicate balance they had achieved with nature. David knew these concerns couldn't be ignored. One afternoon he called a meeting with the community council to discuss these challenges. "We need to find a balance," he said to the group gathered in the church sacristy. "Just as we learn to coexist with the wolves, we must learn to balance progress and tradition, growth and sustainability." After hours of heated but respectful discussion, the group reached a consensus. They would implement a quota system for visitors, limiting the number of tourists allowed in the town each month. They would also create a community fund, where part of the tourism income would be destined for projects that directly benefited local residents and preserved Pine Grove's cultural traditions. As the meeting ended, Hank, the ex-hunter, made an insightful observation. "You know, Pastor, I think the wolves taught us more than just about nature. They taught us about community, about adaptation, about finding our place in the world without losing who we are." David nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude. "You're right, Hank. Every challenge we face is an opportunity to grow, to become a better version of ourselves." That night, like so many before, David took his walk to the forest. Luna and her family greeted him as always, but there was something different in the air, a feeling of change, of something new approaching. As he sat among the wolves, watching the stars that began to dot the night sky, David reflected on the future. Pine Grove had become more than he could ever have imagined, not just a sanctuary for wolves, but a beacon of hope for a world in search of balance. A wolf's howl cut through the silence of the night, echoing through the forest. To David, it sounded like a promise, a reminder that the journey was far from over. New challenges awaited them, new lessons to be learned, but with the wisdom of the wolves, the strength of the community, and the faith that guided them, David knew they were ready for whatever the future might bring. The story of Pine Grove, he realized, was just beginning. 5 years had passed since that fateful night in the forest. Pine Grove, once a forgotten town in the hills of Vermont, was now known worldwide as a model of harmonious coexistence between humans and nature. On a sunny spring morning, David walked through the central square, observing the preparations for a special event. Colorful banners decorated the facades of houses, and the air was full of expectation. "Pastor David," called a familiar voice. It was Sarah, running towards him with a radiant smile. "The first guests are already arriving for the symposium." The International Symposium on Conservation and Sustainable Development was the largest event ever held in Pine Grove. Representatives from communities around the world had come to learn from the town's experience and share their own stories of transformation. As David helped put the finishing touches on the makeshift stage in the square, he couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought them here. The morning advanced and the square soon filled with visitors from all corners of the globe. There were indigenous leaders from the Amazon, conservationists from Africa, development experts from Asia, all united by the desire to create a more balanced and sustainable world. Richard, now a confident and passionate speaker, opened the symposium. "Welcome to Pine Grove. A few years ago, we were just another town struggling to survive. Today, we're here to share a story of hope, a story that began with an act of compassion for a family of wolves." Throughout the day, Pine Grove residents shared their experiences. Emily spoke about the wolf monitoring program, which now served as a model for conservation projects across North America. Jake presented the success of the Sustainable Farmers Cooperative, which had revolutionized agricultural practices in the region. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, described how Pine Grove's educational program was inspiring a new generation of environmental advocates. "Our children don't see nature as something separate from us," she explained. "They understand that we're part of an interconnected whole." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the town, it was David's turn to speak. He climbed onto the stage, feeling the weight of hundreds of hopeful gazes. "My friends," he began, his voice soft but firm. "The story of Pine Grove isn't about wolves or tourism or even conservation. It's a story about reconnection, with nature, with our community, and with the divine purpose that unites all creation." He paused, his eyes scanning the diverse crowd. "Each of us, no matter where we come from, carries a spark of the divine. And when we recognize that spark in all creatures, yes, even in the wolves we once feared, we discover a new way of being in the world." David continued, sharing the highs and lows of Pine Grove's journey, the lessons learned, the challenges overcome. He spoke about the importance of dialogue, openness to change, and the courage to dream of a better world. The miracle of Pine Grove, he concluded, isn't something that happened only here. It's a miracle that can happen anywhere people are willing to open their hearts, listen to the wisdom of nature, and work together for a common future. When David finished, a reverent silence fell over the square, soon followed by an explosion of applause. Many in the audience had tears in their eyes, moved by the story of transformation and hope. As night fell, the celebration continued. Music and laughter echoed through the town as visitors and residents shared stories, ideas, and dreams for the future. David discreetly slipped away from the crowd, feeling the need for a moment of reflection. His steps led him, as they had so many times before, towards the forest. Upon reaching the familiar clearing, he found Luna and her family. The wolves, now a constant and welcome presence in Pine Grove's life, greeted him with serene looks. David sat among them, letting the silence of the night envelop him. Looking up at the starry sky, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and fulfillment. Pine Grove had become more than a model of conservation or sustainable development. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that change is possible, that harmony between humans and nature is not just a distant dream. As the moon rose in the sky, David heard the distant sound of celebration in the town, mixing with the soft howl of the wolves around him. It was a symphony of life, of connection, of possibilities. He smiled, knowing that the journey was far from over. New challenges would arise, new stories would be written. But with the lessons learned, the strengthened community, and the eternal wisdom of nature as a guide, David knew they were ready for whatever the future might bring. The legacy of Pine Grove, he realized, wasn't just a transformed town or a protected group of wolves. It was a new way of seeing the world, a vision of hope and harmony that was now spreading like ripples in a pond to touch lives across the planet. And so, under the starry Vermont sky, surrounded by wolves and lulled by the distant sounds of a community in celebration, David closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the miracle he had witnessed and for the journey that was yet to come.